be my honor and my privilege to prove to you that the old saying, if you wrestle with pigs, you'll both get dirty, but the pigs will like it, is true. This is Bedtime Stories, Grown-Up Edition, Operation Anteater, Part 7. When we left off, the details of the dramatic rescue of Mom Joyce and Regina had been fully laid out at the round table. It took us a few episodes to get there, but that shouldn't be surprising, considering that Regina and her mother were in the hands of the head honcho, the man at the head of an international trafficking organization, an organization that the feds had been after for at least 4 decades. Noah Kirk's ultimate goal was to get out of the U.S. and to never come back, but his plan was to go out with a bang. Or several bangs. As we should know by now from the previous seasons, the trafficking organization wasn't necessarily known for having muscle. They either hired it or blackmailed other organizations into providing it. Snatching humans was their mode of operation. It wasn't just how they made their money, it was how they got what they wanted, and how they got away with the crimes that they committed. Perhaps Noah Kirk should have just cut his losses, but he wasn't a man who was known for letting bygones be bygones. Perhaps if the only people he needed to worry about were the feds, he may have boarded his private plane and headed to a country that did not have an extradition treaty with the U.S. But since the five families were also hot on his trail, he decided that he needed a bargaining chip. And he needed some get back. The five families had made it rather difficult for him to continue doing business, dramatically impacting his finances and changing the course of his future. And to add insult to injury, his daughter and his daughter's mother were colluding with the five families. His daughter's ex-husband was working for the five families. And had he found her, things might have worked out somewhat differently. No, probably not, because he was hell-bent on getting revenge against Mom Joyce. She told him that she was pregnant, and when he told her to delete his fetus, she'd gone missing. 20 or so years later, Regina showed up on his doorstep, and that was when he learned that she hadn't followed instructions. The only reason he'd let Regina live back then was because Regina didn't have any children. The significantly older man and his wife had never reproduced. And while he had no regrets about not being an active father for Regina, he absolutely wanted his bloodline to continue. So he'd made up in his mind that he'd get his lick back. He'd punish Mom Joyce by taking the daughter that she loved. When Regina contacted him, he immediately concluded that the five families had put her up to it. And when Mom Joyce contacted him, he didn't suspect that the five families had put her up to it, but he definitely saw it as the fates being on his side. He decided to take advantage of the opportunity, to take the life of the person who Mom Joyce loved the most, and then take her life too. And since he figured Regina was being used by the five families, he'd lure them into a trap and take several of them out too, while he made his great escape. Unfortunately for him though, all the studying of the five families that he'd done couldn't make up for his limited resources. Yes, he still had soldiers. He still had technology. They still had guns, and they still had explosives. And more importantly, he still had cash money. But none of that was any match for the skill set that landed in his backyard. LJQ, Big Wood, True, Bosch, Stephanie, Stax, Salima, the General Ezra, all showing up in Oregon may not have necessarily been the best idea, but it meant the best of the best had shown up for the job. And even with signals jammed to their radios and unable to connect with their tech team or with one another, they were still impossible to beat. And when they vacated Noah Kirk's deceased wife's family property, there wasn't a man left alive. Javier sent in a cleanup crew and a tech team with extensive explosives experience. A medical team for the injured soldiers. Executed the second in command, who Salima had transported to the Lopez safe house because his services were no longer needed. And then transported Donald Green, Johnny Decker, and Danny Briggs to Noah Kirk's airstrip. On the way, he called LJ and said, "Get Mom Joyce the medical attention she needs. Send Q and Regina to the safe house and tell them to hold tight. And you and anybody else who needs closure, meet me at Noah Kirk's airstrip." LJ shared Javier's instructions. Regina said, "I need to go home with my mother." LJ said, "No, you don't. The feds are gonna have questions, and you and Q are gonna need to be here to answer them." Mom Joyce said, "It's okay, baby. Just listen to LJ for once." Regina said, "Are you sure, Ma? Because you don't look well." Mom Joyce said, I'm not, but I'm sure I'll be fine. Regina said, what the hell am I supposed to tell the feds? Q said, we'll have time to have all that figured out. Let's go. Big Wood looked at True and said, head back to Denver. I'll see you soon. True said, can we talk for a minute? Wood and True stepped to the side, and True said, listen, I just thought that you were about to shoot him. And the only reason why that was a concern is because that would have been bad for business. Wood said, I don't know what you're talking about. True said, yes, you do. When you drew down on that man who was hiding in the bushes, it looked like you was aiming at Bosch. I wasn't about to physically stop you, but I know you saw my body language. Yeah, you was looking where you were aiming, but you don't miss much. Wood chuckled and said, I decided to disregard it. Clean slate. Remember? True said, and I know that's easier said than done. I just wanted to clarify that the same way what you were doing wasn't what it looked like, my reaction to it wasn't what it may have looked like either. In the same way that you want to go back to the way that things were before the world thought you were dead, I want to go back to the way that things were before Amira became a factor. I want us to go back to a time where we always provided one another with the benefit of the doubt, where we assumed the best of one another. I didn't do that back there, but I promise to do better. Wood said, you already are. I'll see you in Denver in a couple days. Be ready for me. True said, I'm ready now. You don't need to go wherever Javier going. We can go back together. Big Wood said, I need to finish this. Genesis deserves to live in a world where Noah Kirk no longer exists. At the same time, Regina was telling LJ, can I talk to you for a minute? LJ said, I don't have time for that. We'll talk when I get to Dallas. Regina said, but before she could say another word, LJ had walked off, opened the back seat of the car that Mom Joyce was sitting in, gave her a hug and a kiss, and walked off. Regina said, LJ. Q said, Regina, are you a glutton for pain? You trying to get cussed out? Let's go. At the private airstrip, a caravan of vehicles pulled up, and in the cabin of Noah Kirk's private airplane, Javier looked at Noah Kirk, Donald Green, Johnny Decker, and Danny Briggs and said, looks like the gang's all here. Are y'all ready to go on a permanent vacation? And then all of the men watched as LJ, Big Wood, and Bosch stepped out of their respective vehicles. When the three men boarded the airplane, LJ and Bosch were in the lead, and they calmly and slowly approached seats that were facing the four men, took seats on opposite sides of Javier, and stared the four men down. As Big Wood slowly made his way down the aisle, he said, which one of you made the call that put my girl and my son's lives in danger? When Donald Green and Johnny Decker looked at Noah Kirk, Big Wood said, you spent the better part of your life getting other people to do your dirty work. You've made it your life's work to victimize the vulnerable. You're not a man. You're a coward. I've never in my life had an art with a man that I didn't address myself. So it will be my honor and my privilege to prove to you that the old saying, if you wrestle with pigs, you'll both get dirty, but the pigs will like it, is true. And then he sat down directly across from Noah Kirk and stared at him without breaking eye contact or saying another word for the next 18 hours. Big Wood didn't go to the bathroom. He didn't drink or eat anything. He didn't make or take a phone call. He never looked away from Noah Kirk. Noah Kirk owned a Gulfstream GIV SP, so it only required one fueling stop in the Middle East. And when Javier's pilot made that stop, Big Wood still didn't break eye contact. LJ was amazed. Bosch was impressed. Javier wasn't surprised. But Noah Kirk was on the verge of having a stroke because his blood pressure was through the roof. Hours into the trip, Javier, Bosch, and LJ all required masks because the cabin of that plane was funky as hell. All 4 of the men had soiled themselves because they'd been denied the basic human right of having access to the onboard restroom. And to make matters worse, Bosch had shared a very detailed description of his last trip to Eritrea, where he'd had the not-so-pleasant experience of seeing what happened when a man accidentally, on purpose, fell in an African pig pen. Johnny Decker had said, "You gave me your word that you were gonna put me out of my misery quickly. If I told you what you wanted to know, I thought you were a man of your word." Javier said, "Oh, I am. No one's laid a finger on you since then. And since a pig's bite exerts about 300 pounds per square inch, what I have planned for you should spare you of that pain, probably about 2 or 3 bites in." Javier said, "We had access to Noah's full itinerary, so we canceled his transportation plans from the airstrip in Eritrea, and Bosch's Connect made us some other arrangements. I didn't see any reason to belabor the point, so we went directly to the farm, and as promised, I put one in Johnny Decker's chest, and each of us put a foot in one of their backs and watched as they became better acquainted with the mud and the bellies of those African pigs. And half the people at the round table shuddered. The pilot needed rest, a good meal, a bath, a massage, the works. And so did we. And we all needed to clear our minds, because that was certainly a sight that was difficult to look away from, but hard to watch. 24 hours later, we were headed back to the States. Then Q said, upon their arrival, I called my supervisor at the FBI and informed him that I'd staked out Noah Kirk's private airstrip in Oregon and that I'd caught his pilot on the return trip with Regina in tow. I'd arrested him and was holding him for questioning. I told him that LJ and I flew in on one of my Uncle Art's Cessnas. I left Mom Joyce out of the equation. I knew that he didn't believe me, but he couldn't dispute my account because the paper trail added up. Lorenzo had handled the manifest, and while Noah Kirk's pilot had told him the truth, that he'd been tied up and blindfolded, held at an unknown location for an undetermined amount of time, and brought back to the airstrip shortly prior to Acevedo's arrival. He didn't have a mark on him. His belly was full, he was clean, and the manifest showed that he'd flown Noah Kirk's plane to and from Eritrea. The hotel receipt and his luggage showed that he'd stayed at the Zeus Eritrea resort upon his arrival in that country, and he had souvenirs in his bag for all 3 of his children. That was a nice touch, Javier. Javier said, I know. Once we arrived back at Noah Kirk's airstrip, I rounded up all of the soldiers who had remained behind to man the airstrip and secure the safe house, and we all headed back to Puerto Rico, while Q, LJ, and Regina wrapped up things with the feds. Regina told them that all 4 men were on that plane and that they'd taken her as collateral, and because she was Noah Kirk's daughter, they returned her back to the U.S. with the pilot unharmed. Alejandro asked, and he bought all of that. Q said he didn't have a choice. I'd made it clear to him when we met in Puerto Rico that Jerry Rouse would be his only arrest as it pertained to the heads of the trafficking organization. Because even with him behind bars, he still managed to pull some strings on the outside. Javier said, but that's no longer an issue either. Jerry Rouse was being held in a federal prison in Arkansas. One of our men was also being held there. We also had another man who owed us a few favors, who was running interference for us with that man. As a result of all the work that was being done behind the scenes, our man is now free. All charges have been dropped, and after he was put on that plane out of Arkansas, that man we got on the inside put Jerry Rouse to sleep. He'll most likely be spending the rest of his life in that federal prison, but that's a small price to pay for what he got in return. He was a member of a Haitian crew out of New York. He and several other members of that crew got knocked. There was suspicions about his loyalty. A hit had been put out on him, and his family was in danger. When I got word that he was absolutely not a snitch, and he was standing 10 toes for his crew, despite the fact that they turned their backs on him, I knew he was the perfect man for the job. By taking out Jerry Rouse, he ensured that he would never get out of prison, the Queen Mother said, which means that his crew would have no reason to believe that he'd turn snitch, because there wouldn't be anything in it for him. Javier said, exactly. They've made amends with him, and they've become allies of the Five Families. Idris said, the Five Families have had a long-standing rule about working with Haitians. Manny said, and we've made some exceptions. After the way they handled one of their own, I'm not too apt to go into business with them either. My goal is just to ensure that they're not our enemies. The more peace we can make, the better. Alejandro said, now that I agree with, compadre. Manny said, so our inside man will be on his best behavior for a while. Eventually, the feds will downgrade him again, because space in maximum security is pretty limited. When they do, we'll be able to use him again as needed. But for the rest of his life, he'll have legal representation, his family will be taken care of, he'll have all of the amenities that he's allowed, money on his books, and food in his belly, Javier said. And all of the heads of the International Trafficking Organization are now a memory, Q said. And the Anteater has been all up and through all of the servers, subsequent files, financials, and property records of the International Trafficking Organization. The stash spots that the Five Families haven't run up in have been run up in by the feds over the last few weeks. We may not be able to eliminate trafficking as a social ill or stop members of this organization who've yet to be caught from creating a whole nother organization. But this one is done. And everybody around the table applauded. Catherine said, so what now, Q? Q said, now I go back to my business. My private investigation firm with LJ and my ad hoc role with the feds. Catherine said, now wait a minute. Sincere isn't fully trained. We still have the issue with Saint. Manny said, and this is probably a good place for us to call a recess. It's getting late. We have church in the morning. We should reconvene on Monday. Sincere said, church in the morning? Manny said, yes. We are all expected at the Salvation Center of Dallas at the 11:30 service. Now that all of the hoopla with the traffickers has been handled, we have multiple children in this family who need to be blessed. CT is flying in for the special occasion, and so is my wife. I'll see it as a personal insult if you aren't present, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, so get some rest. Sincere said, dang, I had plans to get into something tonight. Catherine said, well, cancel your plans. You should have been planning on seeing your sisters. You haven't spent time with them in months. Simone is finally back to her old self, and Chantal is planning to go back to school in Miami. Sincere said, I figured I could get with them after the round table was finished. Catherine said, well, now you can get with them this evening, since you're going to have to go to bed early. When everybody laughed, Sincere just rolled his eyes. And Catherine said, I'll tell them to expect you. Realizing he wasn't going to win this argument, Sincere relented. As the group exited the room, they all went their separate ways, for the most part. After LJ told Q and Angela that he was heading back to the family complex in Denton to be with his children for the evening, and he'd see them the following day at church, they wished him well, and Q said, walk with me, love. As they walked, Q said, believe me, I understand just how difficult these last months have been for you. I need you to hear me when I say they've been difficult for me too. Please don't think that I get any enjoyment out of keeping anything from you. Having to keep things from you is one of the reasons why I hate this job, why I don't want it and never did, and it's why I can't wait to be rid of it. I don't care what happens when this roundtable is over. I am done being the head of the St. James organization. The only thing I want to be the head of is our family. I told you what I did when I was 15 years old on the strength of Anya. I didn't tell you is that Pops Andy knew all about it. I had no idea that my mother was the biggest gangster I would ever know. In my eyes, she was the queen. She was strong, nothing to play with. But the same way I teach our children that you are to be protected, respected, and treated with care, Pops Andy had taught me to treat my mother the same way. He knew my mother was tough as nails, but that never stopped him from treating her like a delicate flower. He liked to pretend like she didn't like it, but I could tell that she loved it. My mother has always been nosy as hell. Eventually, I learned to accept that that's just what mothers do. I was grown before I realized her nosy is on a whole other level, and it comes from a very different life experience than most mothers have had. Like my mother, You've survived your own share of child and adulthood traumas. Like my mother, you are also not a delicate flower, but our sons are learning how to treat a woman by watching how I treat you. Good, bad, or indifferent, they are constantly imitating what I model. At 15 years old, our son had to make some hard decisions. And like I did at 15, he knew where to turn to get the help that he needed to make the best ones he could. I'm proud of the decisions that he's made. I'm proud of the skills he's developed and the ways that he's chosen to use them. Quiet as it's kept, he hasn't done anything that I wouldn't have done if I was his age and in similar circumstances. We both know that at his age, I did worse. Our son is now 16 years old. He's becoming a man. And no, he's not a man yet, but he's had to make decisions that most boys his age will never have to make. And those decisions aren't the kind of decisions that a boy wants to share with his mother. I should know. Which is why when our son asked me to support his decisions and not share them with you, I agreed. Some of them were five family business, and that's just the nature of that business. And some of them, a man has a right to decide for himself if and when he'll share them with the woman he loves most. It was never about disrespecting you. It was certainly not about seeing you as a stepmother. Michael loves you, and he knows beyond a shadow of a doubt that you love him. No boy wants to disappoint, hurt, or shame his mother. That's why L3 told Regina where Mom Joyce was, even though he knew that that was a terrible idea. Your son was so hell-bent on not telling you what he'd done or where he'd gone that he was willing to go toe-to-toe with me in the ring to prove that he was man enough to decide for himself. Can you believe that boy called me a punk and said I was scared of you? He actually thought he could take me, and I let him take the first shot. He got a nice little left hook on him. And when their stroll brought them to the Queen Mother and Idris villa, Q said, "So we getting ready to FaceTime him." And when you see how I responded to that left hook, I don't want to hear no noise.
Mama had stress, I could see through her eyes. Even as a child, I observed every cry. Didn't understand, but I felt that pain. It take memories stick in your brain. I grew up quick, had the heart in my heart. Playing my role, had to do my part. Started getting money just to change our place, but that pain still stuck in my face. I done hurt people that love me the most, trying to protect what I had the most.